For those in the political sphere who are used to advocating for the preservation of tradition, I'm sure you've come across the counter-argument of progress many times. Even if the opponent acknowledges the value of tradition, they still often say something like tradition should not get in the way of progress. The notion of progress is almost axiomatic in modern Western politics, most prominently among leftist movements. Many center-liberals appeal to progress, Francis Fukuyama being the most notable on this front. There's also been, as of late, in the wake of ChatGPT, the idea of technological progress which will eventually result in either apocalypse or utopia. These movements are all very different, and I won't be critiquing any particular ideology. Rather, I will be critiquing what they all hold in common, the pursuit of progress. And so, with that out of the way, we can begin. First and foremost, what even is progress? In its simplest form, it merely means advancing towards a certain goal or state, the goal being, of course, an ideal society. Precisely what the utopia or progression to the next societal stage means in ideological practice varies. But at its core, progress can be defined as a view of a process where society and civilizations, humans in general, move through stages of change over time, becoming ever more advanced and potentially reaching a utopia. As Francis Fukuyama put it in his 1992 book, The End of History, the notion that mankind has progressed through a series of primitive stages of consciousness on its path to the present, and that these stages correspond to concrete forms of social organization, such as tribal, slave-owning, theocratic, and finally democratic egalitarian societies, has become inseparable from the modern understanding of man. The use of the word advance here is crucial, because it qualifies what is meant by change. Although society is clearly becoming more complicated, the word advance does not necessarily entail complexification. This would make it a neutral term. Rather, advance typically refers to progressing toward the next societal state, which implies an objective historical trajectory. If societal change were subjective, the term used would be change rather than advance, so change must be positive. If history consists merely of change, then, through the lens of progress, a trajectory of change can be determined. Where exactly this trajectory leads depends on who you ask, as different theories will give you different answers. Hegel, for example, viewed all societal systems as innovations leading towards the self-discovery of the human spirit. Marxist historical materialism views the modes of production as the main way to determine the different eras of a given society. Lastly, Whig history, as affirmed by Francis Fukuyama, asserts that history is merely the path towards liberal democracy, which he views as the best designed system to meet human needs and maximize human potential. Though these three perspectives are different, they're all united by two underlying assumptions. One, that history has an upwards trajectory, and two, that advancement is made by rationally examining the world and subsequently applying the acquired knowledge. In doing so, one will improve material conditions and moral understanding. This may seem uncontroversial, but I will address why it's problematic later. The bottom line is that progress, as it has been defined, is not real. Civilizations have undergone change over time, of course, but the notion that change has a direction, and more absurdly a universal direction, is a fantasy of the Enlightenment era. Around this time, the French revolutionaries viewed the decadent absolutist monarchy as curtailing their natural rights, and so overthrowing such a despotic regime would be an objective moral good. The adoption of the new Enlightenment morality, which they saw as derived from rational observation of the natural world, delivered French society into a new era of freedom. We can immediately recognize this particular idea of progress as false. If one insists that this ideological development unique to the West is indeed universal, then one has to reconcile it with the drastically different developments of other societies. As one example, the meritocratic and centralist legalist philosophy that emerged in China was developed during a period of chaotic internal competition. Even after 2,000 years and the adoption of Western Marxist philosophy, the mark of legalism is still seen in Chinese governance. As another example, the social norms of Indian society have promoted and solidified a rigid social hierarchy, and in spite of multiple attempted subjugations by foreign invaders, Indian society retained this hierarchical ordering until relatively recently. So which is more likely? That progress does exist despite multiple examples to the contrary, or that history is directionless? Some admit these flaws in the Western idea of progress, but maintain optimism for it. In their view, though progress may be insufficient as a theory of history, it still has ideological utility as a trajectory for politics and society to follow. In other words, it may be false, but it's still useful. If one agrees that it is useful, a topic for a future video perhaps, then the question becomes, is it even achievable? Can a society rationally observe the world around it, and therefore move in a better direction? Even if one disbelieves in historical progress, the answer is quite self-evident. As I said in a previous video, modern politics serves only as a tool for maximizing the happiness of as many individuals as possible. Desirable or not, is that even attainable? The advocate of progress would merely answer that progress is attainable through rationally acquired knowledge, which will improve our institutions and culture. This idea appears reasonable at first. After all, rational inquiry is how we gain objective scientific knowledge. However, it fails on one major point. While rational observation may give us roughly objective insights into quantitative and material knowledge, which aids in the development of new technologies, it can never be employed in the more qualitative domains of society, as societal values and collective morality are beyond simple material reality. The concept of progress fails the most in this regard, because progress is both reliant on and resistant to objective morality. If morality is not objective, then progress has no objective moral direction. On the other hand, if there is an objective morality, then how is there room for improvement? Not to mention that it's impossible to isolate one consistent framework or logic of morality to apply, and even if one was developed, there would be, from the naturalistic perspective at least, no way to justify it. Is there no justification for change at all then? The answer depends on your ideological perspective. Personally, I think change is justifiable, but, unlike those who advocate for progress, I don't believe society should change simply for the sake of change. After all, changing your society to a certain extent may be the necessary action to ensure its survival. The early Chinese clans built centralized states based on merit to outcompete their enemies. There is good reason, then, in certain situations, to embrace limited modification of a society's institutions and practices, so long as, and this is crucial, the society's underlying principles are maintained. Through the lens of progress, tradition is nothing more than the remnants of objectively obsolete institutions, ideas, and practices, which have no place in the modern, advanced world. This view justifies and encourages the erasure of the old ways, just like the French revolutionaries, who thought they were liberating themselves from 1,000 years of backwards despotism and paving the way to a new age. Why? Because tradition is not simply practices and customs like Christmas or Easter, songs and food, nor is tradition simply the obsolete remnants of a time long past. Tradition is that which is passed down. Tradition encompasses our doctrines, values, and principles. Tradition is what informs our morals and our perspective on the world. Tradition is what endows our lives with meaning and creates bonds within our communities. Tradition is not only useful, but necessary. And whatever supposedly progressive society that abolishes tradition will eventually develop a tradition of its own. Removing tradition from a society is like a bird removing the air, and this is what the myth of progress threatens to do.